So let's go through this famous debate for the existence of God, and then we can pause and stop and give your comments, what you think. Like, is there a mistake in the logic? Could it be done better? I'm trying to think what some of the real fun ones are. The dockings. Jordan Peterson? No. Well, depends what you mean by depends. Okay, should we start with this? It's my favorite song, actually, in the whole world.
The system continues to run until it has expired. In other words, when you applaud, you're only taking away the time your speaker has to communicate. His run will begin with 2 15-minute written format. Having explained the logistics, and at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio United, Dr. Stein is author.
First, then I'm defending Christian theism. Secondly, I want to observe, and we should indicate just what it is and is not at issue in the debate, on the basis of which we hope you'll consider the debate. It must be made clear that we are debating about philosophical systems, not the people who adhere to or profess them. Our concern is with the objective merits of the case which can be made for atheism or Christian theism, not related subjective or personal matters. And again, I have 3 reasons for illustrations of this. The personalities of those individuals who adhere to different systems of thought are not really relevant to the truth or falsity of the claims made by those systems. Atheists and Christians can equally be found emotional, unlearned, intolerant, or rude in their approaches. Secondly,
what do you notice right there? As far as he's setting up for the audience that, look, just because somebody can be emotional or there's some type of character flaw or something like that, doesn't mean that the system that they support is false. That would, if you made that conclusion, like, well, yours all is emotionals, so your argument can't be correct, you would be committing the fallacy of what? Ad hominem. Yeah. So I think he's just clarifying, saying, look, so obviously it's Dr. Greg Bahnsen is not arguing for general theism, but Christian theism. What's the difference? We'll find out but just curious what your thoughts. And then obviously Dr. Gordon Stein is arguing for atheism. What's the difference between general theism and Christian theism? What's a theist? We'll start there. And a belief, specifically a belief in the Greek word theos, where you get deus in the Latin. What's this word? Like yeah, deus machina, yeah. Is blank from the machine. What? Power. No, I know. Divine intervention. Omadeo. Omadeo. Mater Dei, yeah, God. So theism, belief in God. Atheism, not believe in God. I don't believe in God. That's pretty straightforward, right? But what God? Where God? How God? Yeah, what, I mean, does everybody have the same idea of God? If you're a pagan, do you have the same idea as a Muslim, Jew, Christian? If you're a Muslim or Jew, do you have the same idea of God as a Christian? So they don't mean the same thing. So now, obviously, all three are monotheistic, but that's not enough. Like, we believe, if you're a Christian, that God's a Trinity. One essence, one God, three persons. Not tritheism, but Trinitarianism. Trinitarian monotheism, whereas Judaism and Islam would be strict monotheism. So obviously he's going to make an argument for the Christian God, not just any God. And Bahnsen-Stein is going to be like, nope, you're dumb, you're wrong, and let's see if they make any mistakes, or how could you make it actually better? Because there's a whole variety of different styles, kind of techniques for arguing for the existence of God and against God as well. So we'll look at those.
Objective claims made about the experience of inner satisfaction or peace, claims that are made, interestingly, by both Christians and atheists in their literature, and promotional claims made about the superiority of Christianity or atheism. For instance, some atheist literature suggests that greater mental health comes through the independence of the atheist outlook. These sorts of things are always subject to conflicting interpretations and explanations, being, I think, more autobiographical rather than telling us anything for sure about the truth of the system under consideration. Thirdly, the issue is not whether atheists or professing Christians have ever done anything undesirable or morally unacceptable. One need only think respectively of the atheist involvement in the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution and the professing Christian involvement in the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the question is not whether adherents of these systems have lived spotless lives, but whether atheism or Christian theism as philosophical systems are objectively true. And so I'll be defending Christian theism, and I'll be defending it as a philosophical system. And my last introductory remark is simply to the effect that I want to concede to my opponent all issues pertaining to the control of ovarian maturation in Japanese quail. Okay, the subject of his doctoral dissertation in 1974 at Ohio State. Dr.
Choke there. He may actually be setting up for appeal to unqualified authority. What did he say the migration of certain quail has to do with issues about theism, knowledge, epistemology? Interesting. Now, that doesn't mean that Dr. Bahnsen-Stein can actually make a good argument against, but you can appeal to your area of expertise that makes you qualified, uniquely qualified, and therefore it should be given a higher status or something like that.
Stein is a man of intelligence, and that's not in question in this debate. I would not pretend to hold my own in a discussion with him of the empirical details of his narrow domain of specialized natural science. However, our subject tonight is really much different, calling for intelligent reflection upon issues which are philosophical or theological in character. For some reason, Dr. Stein has, over the last decade, left his field of expertise and given his life to a campaign for atheism. Whatever his perception of the reason for that, I do not believe that it is because of any genuinely cogent philosophical case which might be made for atheism as a worldview. and it's to this subject which I now turn for tonight's debate. My opening case for the existence of God will cover three areas of thought. They are the nature of evidence, the presuppositional conflict of worldviews, and finally the transcendental argument for God's existence. First of all, the nature of evidence. How should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? What Dr. Stein has written indicates that he, like many atheists, has not reflected adequately on this question. He writes, and I quote, "The question of the existence of God is a factual question and should be answered in the same way as any other factual question." End of quote. The assumption that all existence claims are questions about matters of fact, the assumption that these are all answered in the very same way is not merely oversimplified and misleading. It is simply mistaken. The existence, factuality, or reality of different kinds of things is not established or disconfirmed in the same way in every case. We might ask, is there a box of crackers in the pantry?
What's he saying? The way that, so he's talking about facts, right? So what you often see is that atheists will say that, well, I believe in God if you could prove it, if there was evidence. But you can't prove God's existence because you can't see it, you can't take a, I don't know, pH balance to test the pH on or put it under a microscope. Therefore, it's not a fact. But as Bahnsen's going to point out, is there a mistake there? Do you look for, aren't there different types of facts, and do you look for all facts in the same way? So let's hear what he has to say.
And we know how we would go about answering that question. But that is a far, far cry from the way we go about answering a question and determining the reality of, say, barometric pressure, quasars, gravitational attraction, elasticity, radioactivity, natural laws, names, grammar, numbers, the university itself that you're now at, past events, categories, future contingencies, laws of thought, political obligations, individual identity over time, causation, memories, dreams, or even love or beauty. In such cases, one does not do anything like walking to the pantry and looking inside for the crackers.
So he named a bunch of different things that you ascribe to as facts. Numbers, the idea or the existence of a university. What was another one that he said? Identity over time. What's identity over time? Has anybody ever heard that? You're identical to yourself. You have an identity, correct?
Your identity is yourself changes over time.
I hope not.
Well, I guess your perception of yourself changes over time.
But does yourself change? Like, do you become a different you such that if you committed a crime and you were 20 years ago and you're in court and be like, well, that wasn't me. Obviously, this is me. Does this picture look anything like me? Right? It was like, well, no, this person's 18 years old. And would any judge fall for that?
No.
Even though you look different, go through different things, it's the same you.
Oh, yeah, you're in the same spot.
That's identity over time. Things change, you look different, but it's the same you across time.
I was just going to say, what part of the identity were you exactly describing?
Well, you're not identical to your hand. You're not identical to your experiences. You are identical to yourself, right? So Brody is Brody regardless of whether you're 5 or whatever age or whatever different experiences, correct?
One though, like self-identity.
The self-identity, yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
That, right?
Now, how the heck do you prove something like that? Do you just, how do you prove not the existence of numbers or an identity over time? Do you just get a Bunsen burner out and a microscope and just, no, you prove things a different ways, is what his point. So this is what he calls crackers in the pantry fallacy, that the way that you look for something would be the same. The way you look for love, is that the same way you look for crackers in the pantry? And he's going to point out this is a mistake of the atheists, is that they think that you look for things in the same way.
In the real world. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
There are thousands of existence or factual questions, and they are not at all answered in the same way in each case. Just think of the differences in argumentation and types of evidence used by biologists, grammarians, physicists, mathematicians, lawyers, logicians, mechanics, merchants, and artists. It should be obvious the type of evidence which one looks for in existence or factual claims will be determined by the field of discussion, and especially by the metaphysical nature of the entity mentioned in the claim under question. Dr. Stein's remark that the existence of God is answered, the question of the existence of God is answered in the same way as any other factual question, mistakenly reduces the theistic question to the same level as a box of crackers in the pantry, which we will hereafter call the crackers in the pantry fallacy. Secondly, then I'd like to talk about the presuppositional conflict of worldviews. Dr. Stein has written about the nature of evidence in the theistic debate, and what he has said points to a second philosophical error of significant proportions. In passing, we would note how unclear he is, by the way, in speaking of the evidence which must be used, describing it variously as logic, facts, or reason. Each of these terms is susceptible to a whole host of differing senses, not only in philosophy, but especially in ordinary usage, depending on who's using the terms. I take it he wishes to judge hypotheses in the common sense by tests of logical coherence and empirical observation. The problem arises when Dr. Stein elsewhere insists that every claim which someone makes must be treated as a hypothesis which must be tested by such evidence before accepting it. There is to be nothing, he says, which smacks of begging the question or circular reasoning. This, I think, is oversimplified thinking and again misleading, what we might call the...
So, sounds like Dr. Gordon Stein saying the way that you prove things is you have a hypothesis, and then you look to find evidence to verify that. Okay, so let's see what that means and if that's good reasoning.
Pretended neutrality fallacy. One can see this by considering the following quotation from Dr. Stein.
So keep that in mind. Dr. Bahnsen says the myth of neutrality fallacy. Now, of course, when we looked at the informal fallacies, remember what informal fallacies are. It's when you're purporting that there is a logical connection between a statement supporting the conclusion, i.e. the premise, and the conclusion when there isn't. So we would say it doesn't follow. It doesn't logically actually follow. And you could come up with whatever names you want. It's like, well, and what were they doing when something didn't actually follow? So you could actually, it's not like I said, these are actually rules, like any time that you appeal to authority, it's a fallacy. No. It's just when something doesn't actually follow, and it's because you appeal to an unqualified authority, then name it unqualified authority, or name it whatever you want. You can get unique with. That's why you can actually say, well, what happens when I say that this is unprovable because you can't see it or verify it, and you point out that, look, your mistake is that you believe that you look or prove things exactly in the same way everywhere. Well, you could come up with a funny name like crackers in the pantry fallacy. He's going to have something about, he's criticizing Gordon Stein, saying that if it's simple as this, prove hypothesis, evidence, confirm, fact, what does this mean? And he's going to come up with something called the fallacy of the myth of neutrality. So let's see what he says.
And I quote, "The use of logic or reason is the only valid way to examine the truth or falsity of a statement which claims to be factual." That's the end of the quote. One must eventually ask Dr. Stein then how he proves this statement itself. That is, how does he prove?
So Dr. Gordon Stein says the only way to establish the truth of the falsity of a statement was what? Through the use of logic. How do you prove that? Is what he's asking. Sometimes he'll say, somebody might actually say, and I imagine Gordon Stein will say this, that the only true and meaningful statements are those that can be empirically verified and tested. What about that statement? The only truths that are meaningful and true are those that can be empirically verified. Can you empirically verify that? That statement? Do you find the statement here about? So we got an issue. The statement that the only way to prove things is through logic. Can that be proven? That statement be proven through logic without begging the question? We'll see.
Prove that logic or reason is the only way to prove factual statements. He's now on the horns of a real epistemological dilemma. If he says that the statement is proven by logic or reason, then he's engaging in circular reasoning and he's begging the question, which is constantly.
We learned about begging the question or circular reasoning. What's the problem there? So if I say the only is the only way, did I leave something out, to prove things is to use X. Now, we haven't got to this, but in philosophy, language, and logic, there's something called a second order reflexive statement, where it's like you step back and put it in quotes. Now I'm making a statement about this. Is that true? Do you see the difference? So one, I'm just making a statement. The only way to prove things is to use X. Well, what about it? The statement, the only way to prove things is to use X, is true and provable. What does this refer to? This whole statement. That's a reflexive. It's coming back and does everybody understand what's going on there? Sort of like what we call meta questions now. Now I'm in the meta world. And I'm going, yeah, but how do I know that's true and provable? Well, you just use your X to prove that this statement's true. What's the problem with that? The only way to prove something is to use X. How do I know that's true? Use X to prove that statement. Do you see what the issue is? So he's calling him out, saying that's viciously circular or circular reasoning. We learned about that. Do you think that's a valid criticism?
Who was arguing, wait a minute, who was arguing that again?
Dr. Gordon-Stein's position, and I'm just going to make it easy. I'm going to use X. Plug whatever you want in for X. Gordon-Stein's position is going to be the only way to prove things is to use X. Dr. Bahnsen says, how do you prove that statement? Dr. Gordon-Stein says you use X, because X is the only way to prove statements, namely the statement that I just gave. You get it? Or am I just...
Wait a
If you say the only way to prove something is X, then you're like, well, what about proving that statement? I'd have to use X, right? That's the only way to prove something. But the problem is, that's exactly what's in question.
Oh, yeah, there are many ways to prove something.
And how do I know that's the only way, or that even does it?
You don't.
What does somebody usually say? Hey, well, just grant it to me. Don't question me, and then I can do it, right? It's like, well, wait.
I have a question on this.
Yes, that's all he's saying.
This. If he says that the statement is proven in some other fashion, then he refutes the statement itself, that logic or reason is the only way to prove things. And my point is not to fault Dr. Stein's commitment to logic or reason, but to observe that it actually has the nature of a pre-commitment or a presupposition. It is not something he has proven by empirical experience or logic, but it is rather that by which he proceeds to prove everything else. He is not
Do you get what he's saying there? So that is a commitment. Then there's pre-commitments. That statement. So Dr. Greg Bahnsen isn't saying throw out logic, right? Saying that's fine. But if logic is the only way, I can't use logic to prove the statement that logic's the only way to. Now, it may be a way, but there's got to be something, what he says, so this is a commitment, but he says there must be a pre-commitment by which it makes all these other things possible. So let's see what he has to say.
suppositionally neutral in his approach to factual questions and disputes. He does not avoid begging crucial questions rather than proving them in what we might call the garden variety, ordinary way. Now, this tendency to beg crucial questions is openly exposed by Dr. Stein when the issue becomes the existence of God, because he demands that the theist present him with evidence for the existence of God. Now, theists like myself would gladly and readily do so. There is the evidence of the created order itself, testifying to the wisdom, power, plan, and glory of God. One should not miss the testimony of the solar system, the persuasion of the sea, the amazing intricacies of the human body. There's the evidence of history, God's deliverance of his people, the miracles at Passover night in the Red Sea, the visions of Isaiah, the Shekinah glory in the temple, the virgin birth of Jesus, his mighty miracles, his resurrection from the dead. There's the evidence of...
Well, so he's not saying that Dr. Greg Bahnsen isn't saying there isn't evidence. In fact, I know what Greg Bahnsen's going to say. He's going to say everything's evidence for God. There's nothing that isn't evidence of God. What's the atheist going to say? Nuh-uh, none of it's evidence for God. Which brings into question, what constitutes as evidence? And who determines it? You?
What's the basis?
So somebody's like, here's evidence of, if you say the only evidence that I accept is being true is when somebody does something with a cup of coffee in their hand. So I'm sorry, I don't believe in all this stuff. Well, it just pushes the question back, like, well, what allows you to say that that's the only evidence? Second, does evidence look the same? Something might actually be evidence, but does it look the same to somebody? This is the myth of pretended neutrality, that we can just, hey, just look at the facts. We'll just all look at the facts together. As if our pre-commitments don't color the way that we look at stuff. How many people have met pessimists?
Yeah,
How many people have experienced somebody that's severely depressed? Let's say if somebody's suffering from a bout of depression or somebody's a pessimist, and you're like, look at all the good things in life, right? And you're like, look at this beautiful snow on the mountains around Clancy. Somebody's like, it's not beautiful, I hate it, right? Like it's, they see it differently. Why? Because they've already, like, or think about this. If I'm somebody that's kind of pessimistic, that's like, I don't trust anybody and I think everybody's bad, what are you going to see people as? Bad? Right? Does it make sense to be like, well, let's just look at the evidence, right? It's like, no, your pre-commitments and your ideas are coloring the way that you see the quote unquote facts. We can't just look at the facts in a neutral way, right? So this is going to cause Bahnsen to be like, let's not be stupid and just pretend that we can do that. That's a myth. So let's look at the pre-commitments, right? Can't just go to the facts as if they're neutral. We need to see, is it good to think everybody's bad? And is it good to have that level of pessimism in life? That's what you need to look at, right? That's kind of a meta-analysis, and that's what he's going to do.
Special revelation. The wonder of the Bible is God's Word, unsurpassed in its coherence over time, in its historical accuracy, and its life-renewing power. In short, there is no shortage of empirical indicators or evidences of God's existence, from the thousand stars of the heavens to the 500 witnesses of Christ's resurrection. But Dr. Stein precludes the very possibility of any of this empirical evidence counting as proof of God's existence. He writes, and now I quote, "Supernatural explanations are not allowed in science. The theist is hard put to document his claims to the existence of the supernatural if he is, in effect, forbidden from invoking the supernatural as a part of his explanation. Of course, this is entirely fair, as it would be begging the question to use what has to be proved as a part of the explanation." End of quote. In advance, you see, Dr. Stein is committed to disallowing any theistic interpretation of nature, history, or experience. What he seems to overlook is that this is just as much begging the question on his own part as it is on the part of the theists who appeal to such evidence. He has not at all proven by empirical observation and logic his pre-commitment to naturalism. He has assumed it in advance, accepting and rejecting all further factual claims in terms of that controlling and unproven assumption. Now, the theist does the very same thing, don't get me wrong. When certain empirical evidences are put...
Notice what he says. The theist does the same. So he's pointing out and criticizing Gordon Stein for saying, you have a pre-commitment as far as what constitutes as evidence and facts. Somebody could come back and be like, well, you do too. You're a theist, right? What does he say? Sure. So I guess the issue is, it's not that somebody has a pre-commitment that conditions what evidence and facts are going to be, but whether one is actually justified in doing that. Is that the issue? I found it interesting he brought up that, sure, the theist does that too. So let's see what he says.
Fourth is allegedly disproving the existence of God. The theist regiments his commitments in terms of his presuppositions as well. See, just as the naturalist would insist that Christ could not have risen from the dead, or that there is a natural explanation yet to be found of how he did rise from the dead, so the supernaturalist insists that the alleged discrepancies in the Bible have an explanation, some yet to be found perhaps, and that the evil of this world has a sufficient reason behind it, known at least to God. They both have their governing presuppositions by which the facts of experience are interpreted, even as all philosophical systems, all worldviews do. At the most fundamental level of everyone's thinking and beliefs, there are primary convictions about reality, man, the world, knowledge, truth, behavior, and such things. Convictions about which all other experience is organized, interpreted, and applied. Dr. Stein has such presuppositions, and so do I, and so do all of you. And it is these presuppositions which determine what we accept by ordinary reasoning and evidence, for they are assumed in all of our reasoning, even about reasoning itself. And so I come thirdly then to the transcendental proof of God's existence. How then should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? That was my opening question. We've seen two of Dr. Stein's errors regarding it: the crackers in the pantry fallacy and the pretended neutrality fallacy. In the process of discussing them, we have observed that belief in the existence of God is not tested in any ordinary way like other factual claims, and the reason for that is metaphysically because of the non-natural character of God, and epistemologically because of the presuppositional character of commitment for or against his existence. Arguments over conflicting presuppositions between worldviews therefore must be resolved somewhat differently, and yet still rationally, than conflicts over factual existence claims within a worldview or system of thought. When we go to look at the different worldviews that atheists and theists have, I suggest that we can prove the existence of God from the impossibility of the contrary. The transcendental
Oh, that's interesting. Here's another relation to our logic class. Impossibility of the contrary. Let's see if I can find where. Have we got to? Disjunctive syllogism? We did that, right? Do you remember what a disjunct, or have we not gotten to that yet? So now I can use our now that we're in chapter 6, we can actually use our symbols, right? What does that say? A or B? It's known as the disjunction. Now we'll learn modus, let's see, let me do a tilde, not B, therefore what? A. That's a disjunctive syllogism. Pretty straightforward, right? That's what impossibility of the contrary is. B is a contrary to A. If this is impossible, state not B. That's a way of proving something. Let me give you a classic example in mathematics. Either the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, or they don't. They don't would be they're greater or less. It's impossible that a triangle have angles greater or less. Therefore, the angles of a triangle add up to what? Yeah. That's impossible to the contrary. We do it in mathematics all the time. So that's what he's going to
proof for God's existence is that without him, it is impossible to prove anything. The atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. The atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the ability for the mind to understand the world, and moral absolutes. And in that sense, the atheist world view cannot account for our debate tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Bahnsen, for the opening statement.
All right, just so we know what his position is. Theism or atheism. He's going to say that those are presupposition and pre-commitments. Naturalism or supernaturalism. So there's nothing wrong with having pre-commitments or presuppositions. That's why he said the theist has it too. Okay. The question then is he points it, can this account for, and then he lists it, logic, the uniformity of nature, identity over time, the laws of physics, rationality, experience, morals, blah, blah, blah. And his position is no. And if that's the only two options, right, remember, he's saying we're not throwing out logic or facts. We need to determine what is it makes logic and facts possible. What do we use in order to make those kinds of statements? And if this is impossible, not B, then the way that you prove is by impossibility to the contrary. Therefore, God would be the only way. And let's see if we can pull it up. He's just setting it up like, here's what my argument is. Yeah.
Isn't that a really easy argument for the theist to make? That like, God must exist because like you're trying to like prove stuff the hard way. You're like using science and logic. Well, I have literally something that just explains everything to one answer. God created everything, and like, I don't know. I feel like that's like a really easy argument to make when you just say like, my way is the answer.
Yeah. Well, we got to see, is he just saying that? Is that what his argument actually is? But great point. Is that just simply saying, my answer just explains things. Now, the issue is, in one sense, what does actually explain facts, science, experience? So, what's the other? Logic, morality, numbers, uniformity of nature, identity over time, etc. So I guess the question is really, what does explain this? So you simply saying, my position doesn't make it so. That's correct. I think you're just saying, well, my position does it. We actually have to look, does it? And if there's only two positions on the board, if this does explain everything and the only other position is B and it doesn't, then what are you left with? Does that make sense? So it's not simply just saying, well, my position does and yours doesn't. You'd actually have to say, this would explain everything, and the opposite of that cannot. That's what now he hasn't done that yet, but that's what you'd actually have to do, because part of the problem is just like, that's why he's arguing for Christian theism. Well, what if my God's a rock? What do you think? You got to actually see, well, what does the word God mean, and how would it satisfy all that? I think it's an excellent question.
So you're trying to say that basically, like, your way of working things out cannot solve all the problems, cannot solve all the answers.
I think, well, it's going to be worse than that. It's not that it can't explain it. It makes those things impossible. He's going to just take a step further, because there might be lots of people who are just like, oh, there's lots of stuff I can't explain. The question is, do I hold to a position and another position that cancel each other out? People do all the time. For example, I'm trying to think of a good example. Oh, here's one. I'm a relativist. I don't believe that there's any truths. Okay, that's somebody's position. The problem is they also hold another position that can't be held at the same time. And what is that? But that position's actually true, objectively true. Do you see what I mean? So it's, one might have a position to say that, like, I don't know, I can't explain it, versus I have a position and it makes this other position impossible. See what I mean? Do you see the difference? So he's going to actually, Greg Bahnsen's going to have to show that it's not simply that you can't explain this. It's if you believed in this, you couldn't actually, it would make all these things impossible. That's a stronger claim. Now, we haven't seen if he's done that or not, but we're just setting up the kind of, what's the phrase I want to use? The landscape of where he has to go. Because that's what you have to see when you're analyzing debates. What is the argument? What is the person actually saying? So have you noticed I've stopped and so I haven't said like which one's right or wrong, because I need to know what the position is before you can say that. We're at the point where, what is the argument? What are the positions? We have to lay them out. Here's where I'm going to go. The next position point would be, do you pull it off? If that's where you say you're going to go and what you're going to do, you write papers like this. In my paper, I propose to argue this, right? By bop. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Now let's see if you can pull it off. Does that make sense? So are we clear what the positions are? We'll get a clear idea what Gordon-Stein's are. Is that it looks like he's saying all things or hypotheses are proven in the same way by logic and evidence. And that's how you establish something or prove it as a fact. Greg Bahnsen's argument is, number one, things are not proven in the same way. Number two, evidence is not seen in a neutral way that you can just look at it. It requires presuppositions and pre-commitments. Everybody has presuppositions and pre-commitments that condition their worldview of how they talk about fact, science, experience, logic, morality, numbers, uniformity, nature, and identity over time. The theist and the atheist have it too. There's nobody that presuppositionalists are without commitments. And he says, my argument is going to be either Christian theism or atheism. So we don't prove God by some other means like logic or empirical, but he says it's going to be that presupposition, pre-commitment by which everything is proven, even logic and reasoning. And what's the other option? B, the denial of that. But the denial of that would make denial, reasoning, proofs, and arguments impossible. Not B, therefore A. That's his, it's called a transcendental argument. Now let's see what Gordon Stein's argument is. So that's just the lay of the land.
We now turn to you, Dr. Stein. Your 15-minute opening statement, please.
Can everybody hear me? I say so. Well, I will grant Dr. Bahnsen his expertise on a conditional resolution of the apparent paradox of self-deception, which was his dissertation. I don't know how much more relevant that is to our discussion tonight than mine is, probably not anymore. But I would like to also thank Dr. Bahnsen for showing us that he really doesn't understand too much about atheism. I will try to straighten him out. This is an important question we're discussing. Perhaps it's the most important question in the whole field of religion. Because if God does not exist, then the Bible can't be the Word of God, Jesus can't be the Messiah, and Christianity cannot be true as well as other religions. So we're dealing with an important issue here. Now, Dr. Bahnsen repeated for me that the existence of God is a factual question. I don't think he would dispute that. I think he misinterpreted what I said when I said that we solve factual questions in the same way. I didn't mean exactly the same way. I mean both the use of reason, logic, and evidence. And that is what I'm holding. Now, first let me make clear what atheism is and is not. I think this is a very commonly misunderstood subject. Atheists do not say that they can prove that there's no God. An atheist is not someone who denies that there is a God. Rather, an atheist says that he has examined the proofs that are offered by the theist, and he finds them inadequate. Now, if I were to say that this gentleman sitting on the front step could fly by flapping his arms, I would be making a kind of unusual statement. And it would be up to me or him to demonstrate that he could fly. If he can't demonstrate it, then we don't believe that he can fly.
What his argument is, so Gordon Stein's saying atheism is not the position that I can prove that God doesn't exist. Now, you know, that doesn't mean that he therefore doesn't, right? What he's saying is that the arguments given aren't good arguments. So I guess he's attacking the arguments and saying that's what there are no arguments. I guess that's a different position, right? God doesn't exist and I can prove it versus there are no arguments that are good for the existence of God. If he concluded, therefore there isn't a God. However, suppose I'm an atheist and I say, yeah, but still, and maybe that's why he's saying, I'm not saying that there isn't, but I can't assent without evidence, right? So for example, what if somebody says, I don't know, describes some guy and he looks a certain way and lives somewhere, and you're like, I don't know. I've never seen any evidence. I've never seen any good arguments for somebody actually being that way. Does it mean it's impossible? No. But I can't assent to that until I actually have. I know, then you start asking, well, what's the difference between atheism and agnosticism? I would think an atheist would go a step further, and we'll see what Dr. Greg Bahnsen said. Wouldn't an atheist say, but it's impossible to create an argument for the existence of God? That's an excellent question. Because doesn't it just kind of doesn't it sound like Gordon Stein is like, well, you just seem to be an agnostic thing. Let's give him the floor and see if he can make a distinction between the two, because that's an excellent point.
Now, if he doesn't demonstrate it right now, that doesn't mean he can't fly. It just means he can't fly right now. Now, so we do not deny that he could fly because he can't demonstrate it right now, but we say he has not proven his case. And therefore, we do not believe that he can fly until he does so.
Maybe an agnostic is saying, I don't know if anybody's proven the case, so I don't. An atheist is taking a stronger position, saying nobody has proven the case. Doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, but would that be fair? Maybe if I was an atheist, I would go that direction to distinguish myself from an agnostic. An agnostic says, I don't know if there's any arguments. Atheist says, at this point, there are no arguments. Let's go with that.
Prove so. And this is what an atheist says about the existence of God. He says the case is unproven, not disproven. So an atheist is really someone who is without a belief in God or who does not believe in a God. It is not someone who denies the existence of God or who says that one does not exist or can prove that one does not exist. Now, I think I would like to define a God as well. I'm not so sure I like his definition. I'm not going to stick to just Christian God. I'm going to stick to all kinds of gods. And I'm going to use the definition which both Father Copleston and Bertrand Russell both agreed on in their famous debate. Now, this is both sides, the leading exponents of both sides both managed to agree on the definition of God, so I think it must be at least an adequate one, if not a great one. And this is the definition: a supreme personal being, distinct from the world and creator of the world. Now, before asking for proof of God's existence, we need this satisfactory definition.
Now, that's interesting. This comes up in debates all the time with myself. Is that an adequate definition of God? Yesterday, in the other philosophy class, we were trying to define, suppose 300 years ago, the color red. What is red? Somebody said a color. Is that a good definition? Why? Too broad. Like, well, then that doesn't tell me how it's different from this stuff, right? So it's true, it's a color, right? But that's just a kind of general category of. Is it a good definition to say triangle is a geometrical shape? Doesn't tell me how it's different from every other geometrical shape. Is it a good definition to say God is a personal, what did he say, being, super being,
outside of the earth,
and creator? That might be true. Is that a good definition? That seems to just fit. It's like if I asked, who is I don't know, I'll pick on Brody. Who's Brody? The definition of Brody is a student who lives in Helena. It's like, okay.
what other things are super powerful things that created the earth? Like, what else is that? But
So Well, the question is, there may not be any other entities. So maybe that was a bad example because there's other.
Yeah.
But the question is, of the different religions that all subscribe to that, so that's some attribute. The other religions are mutually exclusive. So they would act like Christianity would say the God of Islam and modern Judaism does not exist. Like, so simply, do you see the difference? So it's like, you name some correct attributes about our God, and the Christian would say, who we believe exists, but that doesn't mean that, therefore, you coming down to a common denominator actually hits that we're talking about the same thing.
Did he say only the Christian God?
Well, this is what Greg Bahnsen's going to say. So I imagine Greg Bahnsen's going to be like, that's a terrible definition, because, and there's a great article that can actually relate to when we get to (6.2). Notice in 6.2, do you have your books with you? Conjunction. I wonder if I can pop this up because I actually like this argument. Do you like how we can relate this back to class? Conjunction, P and Q, yes.
So Bahnsen has to, if he's saying that, who's the other guy?
Dr. Gordon Stein.
So Bahnsen has to argue if Stein is saying that, like, the Stein argument, I mean, definition of God is bad, does Bahnsen have to, like, somehow say, like, that the Christian God that he's arguing for offers something that explains fact science, experience, logic, morality better than his definition, than science definition?
Yeah, that. And I've made arguments that like that too. That so there's a thing called in philosophy and logic intentionality. How many properties do I actually have to get in order to hit? I don't have to get like a perfect, obviously. I don't know everything about you. But my thoughts when I think about like Paris in springtime being beautiful or something like that, it's really interesting. They don't end up hitting Buenos Aires, right? In other words, there's something about our language and our thoughts that are directed and can or cannot actually hit certain actual places, events, people, etc. And I find that interesting that, yeah, when I think about that, something's satisfied so that it ends up talking actually about a place and time, namely Paris in springtime, and not somewhere else at a different time. Now, maybe that doesn't seem that remarkable to you, but think about this. I want you to think about somebody very smart from Greece, and his name's Aristotle. Do you have an idea who this? Now, there's many more things that we could say about. He has a wife, or had a wife. can keep adding. How many of those things are necessary for you to get in order that you actually hit? Who are you thinking of, by the way? And not Aristotle and Onassis. That's really interesting. Do you know who Aristotle and Onassis? Married Jackie Onassis after President Kennedy's assassination. So it's like, well, a deciding factor there would be one's born in Staggeria, Greece, and the other one's Athens, and different times. So then it's like, well, how many things do I have to get right to actually get that? Now, it's a little bit, so that's the thing, that it's, if there is an entity, those things might be true, but am I actually thinking about the entity? How many things do I have to get? Does it need to be a trinity? Does it need to have other properties on top of, or is it just simply now a mental object that's not hitting anything? It's like, yeah, it may be true about the God that exists, but you didn't get enough of them, just like the Aristotle Onassis, and to actually hit the object. That's a concern for us. So that's just, I'm not going to solve that problem right now, but yes, sir.
So like, what's the point of that vision not to be like a person or something, not to hit every single attribute about that person? Complicated if it leads you for whatever point you're going to make about it, have enough attributes.
That's what we're wondering. How many attributes are necessary that we actually hit it, and then we're not talking about something else or a non-existing thing? That's the question. So, yeah, you don't need to describe every attribute, but then the question is, well, like, well, how many? Because obviously I could miss it, or, right?
So, like, the describing attributes like a personal understanding, or is it like universal? So, like, you describe attributes one, like, yeah. So, is it like,
That's an excellent question too. These are really hard questions, right? Because, for example, suppose I'm like a pagan, right? Pagans are pantheists, right? That means God's not transcendent, but the God is not only in everything, this is all God. This is why in kind of pagan religions and New Age, you have God typically identified with a female, right? Because the earth has cycles that are analogous to women, right? It holds life and it births it and different stuff like that. And pagans worship what? Nature. They deny that God's, now, let's say a pagan may even say that God is all-powerful, creator, etc., and name attributes that you who believe in God say, I believe that too. Guess what? You're not hitting the same thing, are you? Because you would say, this isn't God. God's transcendent. So it's like, so it turns out transcendent is necessary or might be necessary, right? So then the question comes up, well, how many? Now, let's take back to this conjunction. It's really interesting. So that's just simple conjunction, P and Q. But you can have a long series of conjunctions, as we've seen in 6.1, P and Q and R and S and T and Z. Now, your religion, whatever it may be, whether it's your pagan, pantheist, Christian, Muslim, has different attributes about God. P and Q and R and S and T. Okay, look at this. The statement P and Q is true if what? P and Q are actually true. What happens if one of them's false? The only scenario in which the statement is true is when all the terms are true. Suppose this stands for Christianity, and suppose T, God's a Trinity. Suppose this is creator, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and transcendent. The Muslim's going to say true, 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 true. What are they going to say about T for Trinity? False. And if this is what God is PQRST. Then what does it mean then if that's false? And that statement is false. That means we're not talking about the same entity, simply just because you're using the term. And this is what's known in philosophy is a flaccid designator. It's not a proper name. That's unique. It's a general kind of common name. And it doesn't pick out, simply the term God does not pick out anything unique. It's not a rigid designator. Some things in logic and philosophy, like you said, are just universally true, that they pick out uniquely that entity, Venus, or the liberal arts college in Helena. That's the question is. So I find that interesting. Are you guys having fun with this? Do you like it? Or you just want to get back to 6.2? Okay, let's pick it up on Thursday. Almost lost mine. And then let me take your